Beijing, China, September 17, 2025. In a carefully worded yet sharply delivered statement, China has issued one of its strongest condemnations to date of the intensifying conflict in Gaza. Following Israel's launch of a large-scale ground assault on Gaza City, Chinese officials expressed both alarm and disapproval, warning of dire humanitarian consequences if the fighting does not cease. The Chinese Foreign Ministry's remarks mark a continuation of Beijing's broader diplomatic push to frame itself as a responsible global actor at a time of mounting geopolitical crises. But the statement also underscores a central reality. China, while geographically distant, sees the Gaza war as a test case for international law, regional stability, and global opinion. Appearing before reporters in Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian laid out the government's stance in unequivocal terms. He declared, Lin Jian said, China firmly opposes Israel's escalation of military operations in Gaza and condemns all acts that harm civilians and violate international law. The choice of words, firmly opposes and condemns, carried deliberate weight, signalling China's intent to distance itself from Israel's military campaign and align with calls for restraint from much of the international community. He continued with a warning about the risks of further bloodshed. Lin Jian said, "We are deeply concerned about the further escalation of tensions and oppose relevant parties adding fuel to the fire." This formulation, often used in Chinese diplomatic language, reflects Beijing's desire to be seen as even-handed. By invoking relevant parties, China implicitly criticized not only Israel's offensive, but also other actors, regional powers, militant groups, and perhaps Western states, whose involvement could intensify the conflict. The heart of China's statement came in its urgent appeal for an immediate halt to hostilities. Lin's words reflected not only humanitarian concern, but also China's broader strategic interest in avoiding instability across the Middle East, a region critical to its energy imports and trade routes. Lin Jian said, "We urge Israel to heed the strong calls from the international community, immediately cease military operations in Gaza, and achieve a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire as soon as possible to prevent a larger-scale humanitarian crisis." By citing the strong calls from the international community, Beijing aligned itself with the United Nations, humanitarian agencies and regional organizations that have pleaded for an end to the violence. The reference to comprehensive and lasting suggests China is not advocating merely for a pause, but for a sustainable political solution. The timing of China's remarks was significant. Israel's assault on Gaza City marked the most extensive operation of its campaign since fighting began, with heavy bombardment, widespread destruction, and growing civilian casualties. Gaza's largest urban hub has long been seen as Hamas's stronghold, and Israel's offensive there has drawn international criticism for its humanitarian impact. China's condemnation therefore served multiple purposes: moral positioning, portraying itself as a defender of civilians and international law; diplomatic signaling, showing solidarity with Arab states and global South partners who have criticized Israel; strategic caution, pressing for stability in a region where Chinese economic interests, including energy supply lines, are vulnerable to disruption. This is not the first time Beijing has criticized Israel's actions in Gaza, but the latest escalation prompted a sharper tone. China has steadily expanded its involvement in Middle Eastern diplomacy, from brokering the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in 2023 to hosting peace forums that highlight its role as an alternative to US influence in the region. While Beijing maintains relations with Israel, particularly in trade and technology, it has often sided with Palestinian calls for statehood at the United Nations. Its diplomatic rhetoric consistently stresses adherence to international law, sovereignty, and negotiated settlements, principles that resonate with much of the global South. China's comments also dovetail with its ongoing narrative about the failures of unilateral military interventions. By condemning what it frames as Israel's escalation, Beijing strengthens its argument that force cannot resolve conflicts and that dialogue is the only path forward. China's statement quickly circulated through international media, adding to the chorus of global voices urging restraint. Arab capitals welcomed the intervention, seeing in Beijing a powerful counterbalance to Washington's traditional support for Israel. European diplomats, while cautious, noted that China's position could add momentum to efforts at the United Nations for a ceasefire resolution. Meanwhile, Israel dismissed external criticism, reiterating its right to self-defense and its determination to dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza. For Israeli officials, China's statement was seen as part of a broader pattern of international pressure that they argue ignores the security threats Israel faces. At the heart of Beijing's concerns is the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. Reports from aid agencies describe shortages of food, medicine and electricity, while hospitals struggle to cope with mass casualties. By framing its opposition around civilian suffering and international law, China positioned itself firmly on the side of humanitarian principles. Lin Jian's remarks echoed the language often used by United Nations officials. His emphasis on preventing a larger-scale humanitarian crisis suggested Beijing is bracing for the possibility of a full collapse of Gaza's infrastructure if the fighting persists. Behind the humanitarian language, analysts point to strategic undertones in China's statement. The Middle East remains central to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, with key infrastructure projects and energy corridors dependent on stability. Any protracted war risks disrupting oil flows and undermining China's economic security. Moreover, Beijing sees in the Gaza conflict an opportunity to contrast its approach with that of the United States. Where Washington has often defended Israel's right to act militarily, Beijing emphasizes restraint, dialogue, and multilateral consensus. This contrast allows China to appeal to countries frustrated by what they see as Western double standards in international affairs. China's latest remarks on Gaza were more than just a routine diplomatic statement. They reflected a carefully balanced blend of humanitarian concern, geopolitical calculation, and strategic positioning. By speaking out against Israel's military campaign in Gaza City, Beijing reinforced its image as a global advocate for ceasefires, diplomacy, and international law. At the same time, the limitations of China's influence are clear. Unlike the United States, Beijing lacks the leverage of military aid or security guarantees in the region. Its voice carries moral weight, but not necessarily decisive power. Still, by calling for restraint at a critical moment, China underscored its growing role as a player in global crisis diplomacy. Whether its words translate into action remains uncertain, but its message was unmistakable. Lin Jian said, China firmly opposes Israel's escalation of military operations in Gaza and condemns all acts that harm civilians and violate international law. And in perhaps the most urgent line of his remarks, he insisted, Lin Jian said, "We urge Israel to heed the strong calls from the international community, immediately cease military operations in Gaza, and achieve a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire as soon as possible to prevent a larger-scale humanitarian crisis."